Welcome to this webinar from the Centre for English Identity and Politics. I'm delighted that we'll be discussing this book, Englishness, the political force transforming Britain, with two of its authors. As regular attendees will know, the Centre is interested in the relationship between national identity and political behaviour, and in the connected issues of the governance of England and of the Union. As I'm sure they'll tell us, our two opening speakers have been heavily involved in the Future of England survey for quite a long time. That work is actually one of the reasons this Centre for English Identity and Politics exists. So if I can just give a bit of background, when I was an MP in the early 2000s, I became interested in the politics of national identity, but initially very much with British identity in mind. But over the next few years, I became aware that a significant number of my Southampton constituents more naturally talk to themselves as English, not in an assertive way, but that was just who they were. And their occasional lament that you are not even allowed to say you're English anymore, it was much more than a reaction to the recent rapid migration, but a statement about a sense of perhaps insecurity about where they stood in the community socially and economically. Well, about 2011, 2012, the Institute of Public Policy Research published a series of papers about English identity using research from the Future of England survey. And that was what began to shed light to me on what was happening and led to the interest that I've pursued politically and academically ever since. 10 years ago, the debate perhaps was, this is interesting, but is it a thing? Does it actually matter? I think fewer people are prepared to put the question that way these days. So just before we start, please use the chat function to comment on and discuss the contributions. You may see a raised hand button, but I'm going to pose the question. So if you have a question, please put it in the question and answer. And you can also upvote questions you like from other people. So to our first two speakers, the authors of the book, the first speaker is Professor Ailsa Henderson, who's a professor of political science at the University of Edinburgh. And then we'll have Richard Wynne-Jones, professor and director of the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University. And Martin Kettle will follow them. But Ailsa, please do open up the contribution.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks so much for the invitation to be here today. It's a real treat to be able to talk about this. So I guess I'll start with like a little story in a way. So in 2007, we applied for funding to compare the regions across 5 European states, and it was one of those schemes where you had to apply to your own national funder. And if they said yes, and if enough of them said yes, then the project went ahead. And every national funder said yes. But in the UK, we were told, you say you want to study England and Scotland and Wales, but we all know there's absolutely nothing to see in England. There's no English identity. There's no English approach to politics. There's no English backlash to devolution. So there's no point in studying England. So you can have your money for Scotland and you can have your money for Wales, and you can go and compare that to Catalonia and various regions in Spain and in Austria and in France and in Germany. And that claim, that assertion that there was absolutely nothing to see in England always bothered us. And it was on the back of that we eventually set about trying to find funding to launch in 2011 the Future of England survey, and that vehicle, that survey vehicle, is now provides the largest corpus of data on English attitudes to identity and governance attitudes to the UK's relationship with the EU. And you would think that would all be fine, but even since gathering the data, we have routinely been told there is absolutely nothing to see in England. And we've been studying this for so long, and in the face of such opposition, that I wanted to take this really rare opportunity to say that we were right and there was something going on. But also, it's a point about, I can see my co-authors laughing, it's also a point about gatekeeping around research, and how certain people's research trajectories can be affected by what is just perceived to be true. So what do we know about England? I want to just make make 2 points, and then I'll hand over to Richard. The first is our two unions argument. So one thing that we note in the book is that English identity is rising, and it's not just a story about English identity rising, but it's also a story about the fall in British identity. So in 1992, the proportion of people describing themselves as British was in the 60s. The proportion of people describing themselves as English was in the 30s. And since then, we've seen a 10-point rise in Englishness. So, absolutely part of the story is about the rise in Englishness. But we've seen a 20-point drop in Britishness. So we're interested in this rise in Englishness, but it is as much about a drop in Britishness. And that's a change that's taken place over 25 years in England. But if we're looking for an equivalent change in Scotland, then it took much longer. It took about 35 years in Scotland. So, and I think that change in identity labels is interesting in itself, but I think it's also interesting because it relates to two other clusters of constitutional attitudes. The first is Devo anxiety, so a sense of disquiet about the constitutional status quo. And that Devo anxiety has a target in its sights. In particular, that target is Scotland, and it manifests itself as frustration with what is perceived to be Scotland's undue influence within the Union, but also undue access to resources within Scotland. And that Devo anxiety is now we see coupled with a considerable sense of ambivalence about the Union, partly related to, but also just made visible by Brexit. And the second cluster of constitutional attitudes is about Euroscepticism. And so these two things are linked. The more Devo anxious you are, the more Eurosceptic you are. But we also know that these are linked to national identity. So the more you prioritize your English national identity, the more Devo anxious you are, the more Eurosceptic you are. And that's our two unions argument that we first made in the second report with IPPR on the back of the second year of English data. And we flesh out in punishing detail in the book. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that English identity is unlike Scottish and Welsh identity, and it is unlike it in two different ways. It has different predictors. So, for example, visible minorities are much less likely to describe themselves as holding a strong relative English identity or English identity relative to their British identity. And we don't see that same relationship in Scotland and in Wales. We know that younger folks, for example, are much more likely to describe themselves as English or as Scottish or Welsh rather than British, but we don't see that same age pattern in England. So English identity is unlike Scottish and Welsh identity in its predictors. It's unlike English identity in its relationship. English identity is unlike Scottish and Welsh identity in its relationship to Britishness. So Scottishness and Welshness is much more defined in opposition to Britishness, whereas Englishness and Britishness are much more tangled together. And the other point is that the attitudes that attach to English identity attach to different identities, non-territorial identities in Scotland and Wales. So identities that attach to Englishness in England attach not to Scottishness or Welshness, but to Britishness in Scotland and Wales. So that the most obvious example is with Euroscepticism, but it's also there in terms of assessments of Westminster influence. And if you turn that on its head, for example, we know that in England, British identifiers tended to vote Remain, but in Scotland and in Wales, British identifiers tended to vote Leave. So English identity is important because of its relationship to Britishness, which is different than the relationship we find in Scotland and Wales. It is attached to evaluations of the two unions in which England finds itself, and it also attaches to a wider cluster of constitutional attitudes about how the state should run. And I'll end on that point, and I will hand over to Richard.
Thanks, Ailsa. John, you're on mute now.
Straight over to you, Richard.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ailsa, and thank you, John, for the delightful introduction. I wasn't aware that our early work had such an influence on your trajectory, so that's actually made my day. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. So, Ailsa and I are kind of determinedly keeping this quite short. So I'm just going to talk about some of the implications of the findings that we lay out in the book in terms of governance. And I think, and given that it's so newsworthy at the moment, and only likely to become more newsworthy after a week today when we have the elections in Scotland and in Wales, we thought we'd talk about attitudes in England and how they relate to the future of the Union. So in terms of statecraft, I guess, the big challenge is to try and find a way of squaring the circle that is English attitudes as compared to attitudes in Scotland and in Wales, especially in the context of Devo anxiety. In terms of, I'm just going to park Euroscepticism, it's maybe just worth saying that in terms of what we know about the attitudes that tend to align with English identity in England, the way that Brexit has been delivered is really entirely consistent with that English opinion, including the way it's damaged the Union. So one of the things that the work that Ailsa and I have done consistently, when asked, leavers in England were saying that, damaging the Union, whether that be a border poll in Northern Ireland and Irish unity, or indeed a second independence referendum and Scottish independence, that was a price worth paying for Brexit, okay? And we're now having a real life experiment to see whether or not our poll findings were right. And so far, Boris Johnson, fair play to him, is playing out exactly as you would expect on the basis of what we know about the opinions of leavers. Now, we will see where all of this goes. But in terms of the internal governance of the UK moving forward and how this kind of Devo anxiety, this veneration of a particular view of kind of parliamentary sovereignty, how can that be rendered consistent with majority opinion in Scotland and Wales? Let's park Northern Ireland for these purposes. Majority opinion in Wales is very clearly home rule, some form of devolution, and the polls are obviously in Scotland is now kind of neck and neck between independents and presumably the status quo. But is there a way of making English attitudes and attitudes in Scotland and in Wales work together in a way that would allow the Union to continue? What's deeply inconvenient for policymakers is that English attitudes really render the two main proposals currently being put forward for the future of the Union really very difficult. One is some form of federalism. We hear Keir Starmer talk about radical federalism. Now, the details on that are, and I'm going to be very diplomatic, the details are scant, okay? But the one thing that we do know, it involves dividing England into some form of regional organisation. I'm being vague because the terms of the debate are vague, but as Ailsa says, basically divide England into Scotland-sized chunks, or even Wales-sized chunks, who knows? But that's basically the idea. The problem with that, and whether they're city regions or what, the problem with that is that, as we show in the book and as our subsequent data mining has shown, that's really not where English opinion is at. And consistently, if you pose it as a choice between all England or regions of England, the all England solution wins every time. So the dilemma for people like Keir Starmer is that they're leaving an open goal for the Conservatives. Because if Labour goes into the next general election saying we will divide England into regions in order to, if there is still a union at that point, in order to make some kind of radical federalism solution possible, the Conservatives have an easy go-to, which is you're balkanising England, you're dividing England up. And our data suggests that that is a really unwise place to be politically if you're on the centre left. So the other option, which is canvassed at the moment, and it's something that the Welsh government is arguing for, is something that Scottish unionists tend to argue for, is what they call shared rule. Okay, and what shared rule means is that on the one hand, the centre plays more of a role in the devolved countries, and we're seeing a lot of that at the moment, right? But the quid pro quo is that the centre listens to the devolved in a way that it hasn't done over Brexit. Quite the opposite has happened over Brexit. And the problem with that is that undermines kind of traditional English notions of parliamentary sovereignty. And again, after we've just done Brexit in the particular way that we've done it, the idea that somehow, in order to keep the 7% of the population that lives in Scotland, let alone the 5% that live in Wales, to keep them on board, we're willing to throw up this parliamentary sovereignty that we've recently reclaimed. Again, that really does run against the grain. So, so we're left with quite a, in terms of where the state goes and how you render these different attitudes compatible, I think it's extremely difficult. I mean, fortunately, we're not politicians, and therefore we don't have to offer constructive solutions for the future. I mean, one possibility is that the UK basically decides there is no democratic route to self-determination for the constituent parts of the UK, which would absolutely transform fundamentally the story that the Union tells about itself. It would no longer be a voluntary association of nations. And that has got huge implications, which I don't think people have thought through. Another option is we end up with this kind of toxic stasis where Scotland is teetering on the edge, but never quite becomes independent. Northern Ireland teeters on the edge. Wales is just, Wales, well, we can talk about Wales maybe, but Wales is in this very interesting position where it's becoming more and more polarised between people supporting independence, people supporting abolishing devolution and assimilating Wales into England. And so you can end up with this kind of toxic stasis as the internal consequence of Brexit. And I will stop there.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. And a lot of provocative things for us to get our teeth into there. The third speaker, respondent, if you like, to the opening remarks is Martin Kettle. But just before I do, could I encourage people on the call, please, to put questions into the question and answer, because I've got plenty of questions I want to ask, but I'd like to draw from yours as much as I can. Martin will be very well known to lots and lots of people from his writing very often about the Union and England and the nations in The Guardian, but many other things as well. But at the risk of going through the history of the Centre for English Identity and Politics, he was also a speaker at an event we had on England and the EU about 3 months before the EU referendum, when Richard came along and presented his data showing that the people who were more English than British were going to vote Leave, and the people who were more British than English were going to vote Remain, and there were more of the former than of the latter, and it didn't look good, which is when I realised that the European referendum was likely to be lost. I don't know if Martin remembers it in that way. But Martin, over to you.
Thanks very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here and to take part in the discussion and to respond to what Ailsa and Richard have been saying. I think I do remember the event you were talking about, and I certainly remember what Richard said much more clearly than I remember anything I said, and that's probably going to be true again today in a few years' time. But can I just start by the sort of little formality of saying that I think in your different ways, all the three of you have been very much ahead of the game in identifying the importance and dynamism of these issues, their impact on British politics, and the way in which this country, by which I mean the UK at this point, is still going to have to come up with some very imaginative solutions if it's to prevent itself from falling apart, because I think that is a very real possibility now, and I think one can see that happening in various ways. I was going to sort of say that I'm probably the oldest person in this session, and I mean, I can easily remember the time when none of these issues applied at all. The first general election that I can remember was in 1964, and that was at a time when England, Wales and Scotland, broadly speaking, could be counted on to change their political allegiances more or less as one. I mean, of course, there were some differences, but the idea that the currents of, oh, sorry, this is my phone. I'm just going to turn this off. I do apologize. I'm just going to mute myself. Sorry, that is the curse of all these events, and I do apologize. I'll make sure it won't happen again. So I think that you know, we have come a very long way in my own lifetime on this. I've been increasingly aware, as John has said, that these issues are really advancing and accelerating as high-profile issues facing the country, and I think it's quite right that to identify the Brexit moment as tremendously regenerative of these different identity forms in British politics. But it was well established before Brexit, and Brexit was both, I think, a manifestation of what was already happening and what was already there, and a stimulus to what is now happening in the way that the others have said. I think it's no longer possible to ignore these questions. In his memoirs, the former Welsh Secretary Peter Hain has a very nice little vignette where he describes having an argument about powers of the Welsh Assembly and the English regions with Tony Blair, and Tony Blair says to him at some point, "Do you know, I'm much more interested in my bucket and spade than in this issue becoming a huge controversy." And that was certainly Blair's attitude, and I'm sure, John, you will remember that too. But I think at that stage, I think he understood and spoke for that kind of that kind of unquestioning view of England. But England, I think, now does need to decide what it cares about, whether it cares, and what it cares about. And I rather endorse what Richard said in his part of the presentation, that we are at present watching a very significant real-time test of how this English approach of the Johnson government is going to work itself out. And the local elections, and there are plenty of elections in England in a week's time, as well as the elections in Wales and Scotland. For once, they'll get a bit less attention than in England than the elections in Wales and Scotland normally do. But there'll be very important elections too. I think it's been very striking how the coronavirus epidemic has made a contribution to all of these questions. To me, there was no more vivid moment in the politics of the pandemic than that broadcast that Boris Johnson made on the 10th of May, I think it was, last year, when he announced the first easings of the lockdown that he had introduced in March. And you almost got the impression as he gave the broadcast that he was discovering that he was speaking only on behalf of England and not on behalf of Britain. Because the lockdowns came simultaneously in March, the devolved nature of control over on public health questions was somewhat masked for the English. But what Johnson said on May the 10th last year was extremely striking in that respect, and I think it came as a kind of bolt from the blue both to him, I think, and to a lot of people watching him, that really he was no longer in this massive, all-enveloping issue and at this all-consuming time. He was no longer really in charge of making decisions for Scotland or making decisions for Wales or for Northern Ireland. I was interested in the book, and it hasn't been mentioned in the presentations, the account of the way in which fear in England was played up during the 2015 general election, particularly around the relationship between Labour and the SNP, embodied as the posters had it in Alex Salmond having Ed Miliband in his pocket. I'd be quite interested to know now, with the benefit of hindsight, how much of that one can attribute to the way in which people in England saw Salmond as an individual and as a particular leader, and the extent to which they differentiated Salmond from Sturgeon, who's always been much more popular, I think, in England than than Salmond was. Salmond, I have a very vivid memory of going to an SNP conference in Inverness long before the SNP became as powerful as it has been for the last 10 years. And sitting in the balcony and finding myself next to a relative of Alex Salmond, and I at some point got something out of my pocket which indicated I was a journalist from The Guardian, and this relative of Salmond turned to me and said, "When we win, you won't be allowed here." And that was an extraordinary moment to me, and I only tell that little anecdote for this reason, that I think Salmond played on English fears fantastically well, in a way that Sturgeon seems to me to have played in a very different way. I mean, in England, where I live, I find lots and lots of people who think very highly of Sturgeon, even whether they agree or disagree with her politics. Just one or two other things before I stop and we throw it open to the points that have been made in the in the presentation. I'd like to say something about the press, actually, because as a veteran member of the media, I think it's quite important to recognize the role of changes in the press in helping to facilitate some of the things we're talking about. You know, when I was a kid, there was only 2 television channels and they covered the whole of the UK. And there were only 3, I think, radio channels, and they covered pretty much the whole of the UK too. Now, of course, we're in a completely different world, and that's without saying anything whatever about social media. And it seems to me that the fragmentation of British politics that has gone along with this in some respects has been something to which the British constitutional arrangement, to which British parliamentary sovereignty has failed to adjust completely. And I completely agree with what Richard said about the challenge to the parliamentary suprematism of the UK, and that would simply have to be addressed, and it's a massive ask to address it. It involves overturning so much in terms of governance, law, and legislation in our politics, that it's really quite hard to see it happening, and therefore it's much easier to foresee that we'll live in this rather sort of unstable toxicity of which he also spoke. I think finally, I just wanted to say that there is clearly a big argument going on within the current government about how to play all this. And at the start of this year, I and a number of other people got the impression that the government was going to take what you might call a more emollient approach to the kind of hyper-unionism, from the sort of hyper-unionism that was developing in the aftermath of Brexit. Now that hasn't happened, but there has been a great deal of internal fighting going on in Downing Street and within the government about how to deal with these issues. It's all rather paused because of the Scottish and Welsh elections, and we'll just have to see when the dust settles and those results are known, how far the government is really in the market for some sort of new initiative in this area. What I fear is that it personally is that it will fall between two stools. If the SNP wins in Scotland, as it looks likely to do, and if it has a clear working majority, I think the pressure on Johnson not to make an early settlement with the SNP will be very, very great. And if the SNP fails, I think the pressure on him to make any settlement will fall away very fast. And so I think the real danger is that these issues will continue to be left substantially unaddressed, and that we will kind of move into yet another period of sort of rumbling discontent, rather like the one that we have experienced since 2014. I'll leave it there and join in any other questions that that come up.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. That was really thoughtful. I wasn't a voter in the 1964 election, but I can certainly remember elections. I didn't think you were either, but I can certainly remember elections when Bob Mackenzie had a swingometer, which measured the swing from Labour to Conservative or vice versa, and it worked right across the British the island of Britain. For the last three general elections, each of the four parts of the United Kingdom had been contested by different political parties, and in each part, a different political party has won. So the sense that there is a British politics, in the sense of the same parties competing more or less everywhere, has disappeared, as indeed has been the alignments between the Northern Ireland mainstream parties and the Labour and Conservative side. What I'd like to do is quickly go back to Richard or Ailsa on one point you raised, which is about the 2015 campaign, which was possibly the first one when the idea of an English interest seemed to emerge, at least in the campaign. Was that a Salmond effect, or would we expect something similar if the polls once again pointed to a hung parliament and maybe a minority Labour government dependent on SNP support? Richard, Ailsa, do you have a thought on that?
Do you want to go first, Richard?
Yeah.
Sorry, was that you or me going first, Ailsa? I didn't.
You looked like you were keen to go first, so no, I was just letting you go at it.
Thank you. So even though Ailsa's a co-author, we're not quite telepathic, so I do apologise. So yeah, the book, for those who haven't read the book yet, and obviously I hope that you will all read the book, but it starts with an account of two different electoral events: the 2015 general election and the 2016 Brexit referendum. And of course, these are interlinked because it's the unexpected Conservative majority in 2015. And of course, there was a manifesto pledge to hold a referendum on European membership, which many observers believe that, you know, Cameron never expected to be in a position to have to deliver upon. But anyway, it's that majority that makes the 2016 referendum inevitable. And what's interesting about those two events is that in the first one, there's a very deliberate attempt by the Conservative Party, which we document in the book, to mobilize English sentiment. And it's not simply, and this is the key point, it's not simply that it's about the SNP and it's about SNP influence. The people behind the campaign are very clear that they were aware that they were mobilizing English resentment at foreign influence, or the influence of outsiders, i.e. Scots. I mean, and they are incredibly disarmingly frank about this, and we detail this in the book. And of course, the whole point was, at the time, it looked as if Labour would never be able to get a majority, because all the polls were suggesting that the SNP were going to clean up in Scotland. So that was but it wasn't simply the SNP. And it wasn't simply salmon. Sorry, I am answering your question finally, John. It wasn't simply salmon, because during the campaign, actually, that poster shifted from being Alex Salmond to being Nicola Sturgeon, because as you'll recall, it was during that election campaign that Sturgeon really became a major kind of political celebrity south of the border. It was in her contributions to the leaders' debates that she really broke through. And interestingly, in terms of the 16 referendum, and again, this is detailed in the book, for reasons best known to itself, the Remain campaign used Sturgeon in the televised debates, despite the fact that their own focus groups were showing that she went down very badly in Middle England. So it may well be the case that some of Martin's friends, and indeed some of my friends in England, think that Sturgeon is fantastic. But the evidence that the Remain campaign had from their use of her was that she went down poorly in Middle England.
Okay, thank you. Can I put now a question, straightforward one, well, apparently a straightforward one, but perhaps it isn't, from Tim Kelton. Does the new emphasis on English identity tend to incline more politically right than left? Who would like to answer that question? And in what sense?
The answer is an unequivocal yes. And we know that in terms of the book does a number of different things. It predicts the type of person that is likely to hold an English identity, but also the type of person that is likely to have a strong English identity relative to their British identity. And we know that it's relevant there. We also know that when we're talking about an English worldview, what are people feel English, but what are the kind of political attitudes that they have? What are the constellations of attitudes that they also hold? We also know that it's relevant there and relates to Euroscepticism, but also different attitudes towards devolution, and also a sense that people have a low sense of efficacy, so a low sense of being able to have an impact on have an impact on politics. There's nothing inevitable about that. It is just in part because of the parties that have chosen to mobilize English national identity in the political campaigns that are of interest to them. So there's nothing eternal about the fact that English national identity seems to be aligned more with the right than the left. In part, it is because of the relative silence on English national identity from parties on the left. So there's nothing inevitable about it, but it is absolutely the case that in the data you see a clear relationship there, and it does align more on the right.
Thank you. Can I then go on to a question which follows almost directly from that? Jennifer Wilson's asked about whether the entanglement of Englishness with Britishness is one of the things that is identified from within Scotland and is seen as, if you like, a problem with attitudes in England. But can I throw into that an additional question, which is that in some ways in the book, Britishness, as say represented by Boris Johnson, who is undoubtedly a unionist in his own politics, maybe an Anglo-centric unionist, but a unionist, is not the same as the sort of people who want an English parliament or people who want English MPs making English laws. So where does the Englishness stop and the Britishness start, or how are they mixed together? Because you have this distinctive Englishness, but as you say, it has a relationship with Britishness. And you might want to comment on Jennifer's question, possibly the Englishness is seen as much as the Britishness from north of the border. Can you untangle that relationship a bit?
Gosh, that's a tricky one. Can I try to understand the question as it relates to Scotland? I'll take that part of the question.
I read out Jennifer's question is, I wonder if the fact that Englishness is entangled with Britishness is one of the reasons for the kickback against this by Scotland.
But the kickback against what? Against Englishness or against
Yes, I think you're about
the union.
I'm guessing a kickback against perhaps the Westminster government or the union as it is at the moment. She goes on to say, if there had been a more comfortable separate Englishness, then Britishness itself would have been clearer. So she's asking about the way in which the entanglement between the two is seen in Scotland. And I'm asking a slightly different question, is that clearly there are some aspects of Englishness that are not the same, certainly as British unionism. Yes,
I'll park that second one for now. I don't think that the entanglement of, I don't think Englishness taints Britishness, if that's the question in Scotland. I don't think that's the problem. I think it is assessments of the UK government. I don't think it is I don't think it's an interpersonal hostility to those in England. I don't think it's an interpersonal hostility to those who describe themselves as English. I don't think it's an opposition to English devolution either. So I don't think there is a kind of poisoning the well effect of Englishness as it relates to Britishness, insofar as we're trying to figure out how Scots feel about that. Certainly we know an awful lot about how the four constituent parts of the UK feel about the union, but also feel about each other. And we know, the book talks a lot about English attitudes and English resentment looking out the way. If we're thinking of Scottish attitudes, there is a sense that England gets more than its fair share of resources, but that's a fairly typical view outside of England. Everyone is kind of convinced they themselves get less than their fair share. Everyone's convinced that somebody else gets more than their fair share. Everyone outside England thinks it's England that gets more. Everyone in England thinks it's Scotland, right? So I don't think there's anything. I don't think there's anything about the English people, though, or the relationship between Englishness to Britishness that is driving any kind of opposition. That would be my most succinct answer to that one. I'll leave the other untangling to. So
Richard, can you say a bit more about the relationship between Englishness and Britishness that you talked about?
Yeah, I can, and then I'll link to Johnson in all of that. So one of the points that we make very early in the book, and it's one that I tend to repeat when we're given an opportunity to speak about it, is that one of the things that confuses people about English nationalism and the arguments that we make about English nationalism is that people tend to look at English nationalism through a lens of a set of expectations created by contemporary Scottish, Irish and Welsh nationalism, okay? And because Scottish, Irish and Welsh nationalisms have become a rejection of Britishness, they expect to see English nationalism as a rejection of Britishness. And it isn't, okay? It absolutely isn't. It's a veneration of a particular version of Britishness, a particular version of Britain's past and potential future. And, and I open parenthesis, if you're interested in these kinds of things, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Welsh, Scottish and Irish nationalisms were not a rejection of Britishness, okay? That all happens later. So actually, if you're aware of that 19th century history, what we see in England is not as unfamiliar. But anyway, so, and this is where I get to Boris Johnson, because Boris Johnson is an incredibly English politician, okay? As indeed was Theresa May, when viewed from, certainly when viewed from my perspective with my accent, okay? But Johnson doesn't speak much about England directly. He will occasionally say that the Scots are verminous, or he will, but he'll talk about the Englishman's right to go to the pub. But he focuses very much on Britain. But he talks about Britain in a particularly English way, if I can put it like that, okay? So it's those assumptions about Britain's rightful leading place in the world, its glorious history, the island nation trope, all of these things, okay? There's a particularly English view of Britain and Britishness that's venerated by people that tend to have a strong English identity. And so that's the kind of stuff that we speak about at some length in the book. And disentangling them is in a sense futile, because they are entangled. It's understanding the nature of the entanglement that's key. But Martin wants to get in, so I'll stop speaking.
Martin.
No, I didn't want to interrupt at all. I mean, Boris Johnson is unquestionably not Scottish, Irish or Welsh. And he therefore, as it were by elimination, is English. And of course he embodies a lot of tropes which can be seen in a certain light in England, and by and large not in Scotland, Wales or Ireland. But he's a deeply untypical person in very, very many ways. And it's, I mean, to say that he is very English and Theresa May is very English, and maybe then to go on and say that, Clem Attlee was very English, or John is very English. All these things are true, but they don't necessarily get to the heart of what the Englishness bit is about. I mean, can I come back to the original question? I mean, I'm happy to talk about Boris Johnson till the cows come home, but just to get back to the very first question about whether the English identity is more right than left. It's not much different in my experience and from my study of political history from that of other countries. It's a bit more right-wing, but it's not as right-wing as Italy, say. And it's, maybe not quite as left-wing as Scotland historically has been, but that's far from saying it is a right-wing country and a right-wing, and Englishness is a right-wing thing. The problem is, I think, and John has written about this far more and more authoritatively than I could ever do, is that the left of centre has never really got engaged in the politics of Englishness, and doesn't feel comfortable for a variety of reasons in the English conversation. But since we can all agree that whatever else happens, England is not going to go away. I mean, it's still going to be this big country on this island, whether it's been left on its own by the departure of the other parts of the UK, or whether it remains the largest part of the UK. It's not going to go away. the current mood in England, as represented by Brexit, is a challenge to many aspects of the progressive tradition. And unless the left of centre joins that conversation and finds a way to have its voice heard in that conversation, then not much is going to change very quickly. That's why, I think, the idea that Labour might produce another regional answer to Englishness, it fills me with dread for the. I think Labour has got to embrace in some way the idea of a national English forum, a parliament, if you want to call it that, with all that entails, and recognise that it has a case to make within the conversation about Englishness. For God's sake, I mean, there is a long enough tradition of radical Englishness, going back a 1,000 years and more, that it can draw on. It doesn't have to be Boris Johnson's version of history that defines what the English mind or the English spirit is. But I think, it's just got to engage. It doesn't happen.
So thank you, Martin. That sets up very nicely, well, several strands of questioning that I have come in that I want to pursue. The one that was sent in advance was from Robin Tilbrook, who is the chairman of the English Democrats, who asks the panelists what they predict as the prospects of the only campaigning English nationalist political party, the English Democrats. But if we may, could I broaden that to actually ask for thoughts about how if it's the case, as Ailsa says, that Englishness has been mobilised effectively by the Conservative Party and also UKIP and Brexit in the past, but how does a centre or left of centre party engage with English identity? And perhaps specifically on the English Democrat question, is there a space in British politics for a party that sought to represent Englishness as a party in its own right? Because that party certainly doesn't exist as a mass party at the moment. Richard or Ailsa, you both wrote a joint article on some of this for Prospect, I saw on St George's Day, thinking particularly about Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. So would you like to have some thoughts? I mean, it's one thing saying you have to engage in it. What does engaging with it mean if you are a centre or left of centre political party?
I'm being handed this one. Thank you. I think that's technically what you call a hospital pass, isn't it? So, I mean, the Conservatives are mobilising this very successfully, and I think it's important. So, which is one of the reasons why Robin's party is not making the headway that perhaps Robin would like to see. So, not only was this very deliberate mobilisation in 2015, but if you look at the data from the subsequent general elections, and I know, John, that you've done some work on this, you see that the Conservatives have been hoovering up the votes of English identifiers. And it's interesting, the way that political commentators and academics, and we're all equally guilty, somehow want to talk euphemistically about this. So we get phrases like the red wall being thrown about. But actually, what we're talking about is hoovering up the votes of English identifiers. Labour's been doing very well amongst British identifiers in England. Those people who prioritise their British identity. Labour's done really well there, but they're just not enough of them. So the demographics of this are terrible. So the Conservatives are doing that very well. And and I don't, they certainly were doing this self-consciously in 2015. That, all the evidence is there that they were aware of the importance of English identity and of Devo anxiety. But I don't know to the extent that they've been deliberately targeting English identifying voters in 2017 and 2019. But the way they talk about Britain and Britishness appeals to those voters. Okay, so so somebody is occupying that area, which makes it very, very difficult, I think, to answer one of your questions, John. I think there's no space there, therefore, for an English nationalist party beyond the Conservative Party, I suspect, because that territory is being occupied very successfully at the moment. In terms of what does the centre-left do, it stops digging. I mean, I know, this is not much of an answer, but it stops digging. So I genuinely think, and this is to echo what Martin was saying, that if Labour ties itself to English regionalism against England as a unit, that is just an open goal. And I've been speaking at various events online during the lockdown where I keep, we've been hearing this for a decade, Ailsa and myself. We talk to audiences on the centre left in England, and they say things along the lines of, well, you can't talk about England. England is incredibly varied. English national identity is so amorphous, and what people really want is a regional solution. And you bang them over the head with the evidence and say, with great respect, no, you're seeing what you want to see here, but it's still people like John are lone voices, or there aren't many of them. So stop digging. And then find, and I think there's a strong argument for decentralizing power within England, but actually don't focus on that as an alternative to finding a mechanism for recognizing England. And one way of doing this, to be practical, one way of doing this would be to look again at English votes for English laws. Mm-hmm. Because English votes for English laws was this hugely popular reform that happened in 2015 that nobody realizes it happened. We tried to work out how many people in England knew that English votes for English laws was introduced. Our best estimate was 2% of people realized it happened. Why are people not aware of it? Because it was constructed as a way of not creating a forum for an English voice. It's a technical fix, which basically, in my view, makes life difficult for the Labour Party if it were ever to gain power. It's a kind of a backstop mechanism rather than a forum which creates a space for an English debate to emerge. So if the centre left is queasy about an English Parliament separately, and I make no comment about that, but then look again at English votes for English laws, for example, and is there a way of doing that, creating a distinct English space within Westminster? That might be another way of doing it. There are, if you want to get creative, there are lots of things that you can do, but working out what you're trying to do is key. And I think, and I'm maybe speaking for Ailsa against her wishes here, but I think it's about creating a space for an English voice to emerge, which is the key thing here.
Thank you.
English voices, maybe.
Ailsa.
Yes, I was just going to jump in there. I mean, I think there are clues in the data, right? And one of the clues is about evil. So when we asked about it, I think we asked half the sample, what do you think's going on? And half the sample we said, look, this has happened. What do you think about this? And one thing we found was that most folks didn't know that evil had happened, but even when you told them that it had happened, they didn't think it went far enough, right? And so people weren't aware that it was going on. There was a sense that the introduction of evil did not satisfy demand for evil, right? And so I think there's loads of evidence that more could be done there. I think the data are also quite clear that there is an openness to an alternative framing around Englishness. So we asked people, what makes you proudest to be English and what makes you proudest to be British? And we asked in different ways. We asked a kind of closed-ended question where we came up with a list of things that we thought people might be proudest of. But we also had an open-ended question, and we asked, well, right, what is it? What's going on? And the interesting thing is, in part, that when they're describing what makes them proudest to be English and what makes them proudest to be British, there is a considerable degree of overlap. People mention the same institutions, the same values, the same social customs, for both of those identities. But there are also instances where people took the opportunity to deliberately contrast what they felt was going on with Englishness and Britishness. And in the book, we pull out two of those examples. And one of the respondents was saying something along the lines of, you know, why on earth would I be proud to be English? They're all racists and backward looking and right wing and thugs, and that's got nothing to do with who I am. Whereas Britishness is the identity of openness and multicultural support and a kind of cosmopolitan, outward looking vision, you know, this kind of Gordon Brown vision of what Britishness stands for, right? And that is the framing that we get sometimes around what is going on in England. But then there were other respondents who were saying, why on earth would I be proud to be British? It's this exploitative, ruthless, militaristic empire, when in fact, what I'm really proud of is I'm proud of Englishness, this notion of kindness and gentleness, this kind of bucolic existence that comes to mind when I think of England, right? There are people that hold very different constructions of what Englishness means for them and what Britishness means for them. And we've heard rather a lot about one particular pairing of what Englishness and Britishness means. But that's not to say that people don't hold an alternative vision in their minds. It's just one that we don't hear an awful lot about. It's all in the framing.
Thank
Separately, just one brief thing on the notion of English governance and preference for an England-wide solution. And this is a constant in the data. And the other thing I think that's worth noting is that it's not just the case that the English electorate as a whole prioritizes having something that is there for all of England as England, rather than carving it up into Scotland-sized chunks, but that this is true for people who prioritize an English national identity, but it is not just similarly true, equally true for those who prioritize a British national identity. So this is one of the cases where national identity doesn't help us explain what's going on. People in England want an England-wide solution, and that's true if you describe yourself as English, but it's also true if you describe yourself as British. That's how far the debate has moved on, and that is a large part of the reason why the Labour Party is in the trouble that it's in.
Thank you. And the discussion, I'll bring you in, Martin, on the next one as well. The discussion about what English might mean touches on questions, and I hope they don't mind me running them together, put in by Gareth Young, Jonathan Chaplin, and Matt Gilks. And I was prompted, I think Ailsa, right at the beginning, you sort of said that visible ethnic minorities in Scotland are much more likely to identify as Scottish than they are in England as English. And of course, British multiculturalism only happened in England and also didn't involve Englishness. So it was only Britishness was ever constructed by the state and civic society as a multicultural identity. Englishness is moving in that direction. But Gareth Young's question is, should actually liberal politicians and governments help inculcate a more progressive and inclusive sense of English national identity, and has that been neglected in the past? Jonathan Chaplin asks, if you like, is there a more distinctive English cultural identity with traditions and values and civic practices that might emerge that perhaps didn't need so much an expression via an English parliament? And Matt Gilks asks slightly differently, as English self-identification develops, can we have a sense of whether it's more likely to go in a radical or a conservative direction? And maybe a question for Martin, which English philosophers and thinkers one might reach back towards for a good view for the future? So some questions there. Should government be more proactive in helping to shape an English identity? What direction is it likely to go in? What would we draw on to move it, if we wanted to, in a more progressive and inclusive direction? Martin, can I come to you first?
Well, there's a lot there. So there's been a huge, I mean, the 20th century, if not before, contained an enormous debate about the different traditions which made up Britishness and Englishness and English culture, British culture. I make no differentiation between the two. I think in particular of, for instance, the literary tradition and the historical tradition, the ones that I know a bit more about than most. But there's clearly many other fields where this is true. I mean, the idea that there was a great island story that is the sort of imperial version of English history has been fought and contrasted for generations now with a much more liberal and often more Marxist view of the of English history. And that date, I mean, that goes back into certainly into the Edwardian period and certainly the interwar period. So there's a long tradition. I think it's F.R. Leavis who wrote this book called, didn't he write a book called The Great Tradition? The argument that the argument in terms of English literature and the Great Tradition became an argument about whether there was another great tradition, a more radical great tradition to counterpose to what was sometimes being elevated as the sort of the great English story tradition. So I think there's lots. I mean, where do you go back to? You know, I mean, you have to go back to the Norman Conquest. I mean, you can if you want to go back to the Norman Conquest, and English radicals of the 17th century and the 19th century certainly did. My tutor at university in history, Christopher Hill, wrote a very famous essay called The Norman Yoke. And it was this was an essay all about the idea that free-born Englishmen had their liberties taken away by the Normans in 1066, and that from Hereward the Wake onwards, they were engaged in trying to reclaim those rights. And the Norman yoke theory was still extremely powerful in the 19th century. If you look at the history of Chartism, it's full of references to lost English liberties, which the early Labour movement and radical movement of that period sees itself very explicitly as trying to reclaim. Now, we've kind of lost that in the 21st century, that sense of the Norman Conquest as being the kind of pivotal event in British history. And I'm not going to go on further with my kind of amateur sense of English medievalism, but I think it's really important to recognize that there is a ton of stuff to draw on, and it's mainstream. It's not just saying England is full of horrible imperialist, racist people, and then there've always been a few, good souls on the margins who have stood out in their own sort of quirky way, like John Bunyan or whoever, who have suffered for their apostasy. It's not like that. It's not like that. I mean, where on earth does the Labour Party come from? I mean, it's not based, the Labour Party has deep English roots, as well as deep Scottish and Welsh roots. Ditto the liberal tradition. So there's lots to draw on, and we could go into that in more detail on another occasion. So, is there a more progressive Englishness? Unquestionably, there is. Unquestionably, there is, and I agree very much with the point Ailsa made, that very often, I think, when people in England articulate it, they don't differentiate very much between what is English, what they think of as English in this way of looking at the world, and what they think of as British. I always think of it was a rather tragic moment in Gordon Brown's premiership, when there were very bad floods in Cumberland, and he went up there to visit the communities, Workington and Cockermouth, places like that, that had been devastated by very, very severe flooding. And he talked to these old ladies in this school room where they were kind of being sheltered from the storms and the floods. And he said to them, you know, isn't this the way we do things in this country? You know, we all pull together and help out, and we all help each other. And you know, you could see he was longing for them to say it's because we're British, because that was his thing of the time. And they said, yes, that's exactly right. Said these old ladies, that it's what being English is all about. And you know, you had kind of collapse of stout party for that. And you know, so I'm full of optimism. I just think it's a very untilled field.
Thank you, Martin. Ailsa, Richard, I mean, as political scientists, you study the data and what people say to polls and whatever, but along the way of tracking English identity, have you gathered a sense of what are the points, the arguments, the images, the institutions that shape this identity? Because clearly it is, as you said, it wasn't really there so apparently back in the early 1990s, possibly even just at the turn of the millennium. So something is it just external events, or have there been some conscious or semi-conscious attempts to shape what this identity means? And where do we look for influences in the future?
I'll start an answer to that partly by addressing the previous set of questions, because I think the question about how, you know, should governments or parties try to inculcate a vision of Englishness that aligns with liberal values, and I mean, it's a tough one, but I was thinking, well, to what end? You know, why would you try to do that? And in trying to identify why you would try to do that, I think there's an answer, John, to your question. And I think it's important. I mean, part of me wanted to say, you know, not for me, the normative issue. I can tell you whether it would fly or not in the electorate. But I think there's three things going on. I think here's why probably, yes, some attempt must be made. First, because I think it would help to satisfy an English electorate, because their current dissatisfaction is if you care about the union, it is a deeply destabilizing force within the union. And so addressing that dissatisfaction, I think, is important if you care about the union. And for some people, that's a big if. The second is, I think it's important because it is absolutely clear that there is a considerable sense of English grievance around how England itself is governed. And so part of that framing around Englishness could also seek to identify, or should also seek to address an answer or identify an answer to that. And I suppose a third reason why you might want to adjust the framing or have a go at reframing things is to save a national identity from certain kind of unhelpful constructions. And by unhelpful, I mean unhelpful to the electoral advantage of particular political parties, right? So I think that's why probably, yeah, I think it's important. I think, you know, we speak about how this politicized Englishness is having an impact on British politics. And I think when you speak about when something becomes politicized, you need a message, you need a messenger, and you need an audience. And one thing that's very clear is that there is an audience, but the message and the messengers are a bit lopsided, and I think that is having an impact on things. I think the notion that it becomes politicized also relates to the fact of how identity becomes salient and important and aligned with different kind of wider interpretations about how the state should be organized and how the state should be run. So for me, John, in answer to your question, I think it's not about what does Englishness mean, but rather what can we do for England? And I think that's the more, maybe that's the Canadian in me, but I have, you know, it's a less ambitious, more practical kind of approach to what would be perhaps quite helpful. And it's addressing English dissatisfaction. You know, it's not, then there is not a widespread sense of grievance just because folks like to moan. I mean, there are things that are deeply, deeply wrong. And we know that in England, there is a strong sense of English identity. There is also a strong desire for subsidiarity. And that strong desire for subsidiarity is partly principled and partly a reaction to an incredible centralization of power. So to my mind, that reframing and that adjustment should be addressing practical solutions to what we know about the different problems that people feel are going on in terms of the state, or the different problems that present themselves in the state.
Throughout this webinar, all the speakers have had a remarkable ability to anticipate the next question I was about to open up. So I'll come back to that in just a moment. But Richard, any thoughts about the shaping of identity? You're muted.
Apologies. Yeah, I mean, like Ailsa, I'm always slightly queasy about the notion of the state trying to press a particular version of identity. And I'd be unhappy about that at the Welsh level. I'm equally unhappy about the way that the current UK government seems to be pushing a particular version of Britishness and British symbolism until you get the feeling they won't be satisfied until there's a Union Jack hanging on every house in every village in Wales. There's something, I find that, but I think one of the interesting things about England, and this is something that I think both Martin and Ailsa, and indeed you, John, have already mentioned, is there's such an unwillingness by UK level politicians to name England. We've seen this through the COVID press briefings, where Martin is right in that that May briefing where it was obvious that suddenly Johnson was confronted by the reality that he wasn't making all of these decisions for all of the state, and yet even despite that realization, there's been a complete unwillingness to name England. And what you then ended up with, and this is kind of general, and what you then see is this weird vacuum at the heart of British politics, where we maintain the pretense that nothing has changed at the centre, and yet around the periphery, everything has changed. And this is the kind of dilemma, because before Brexit, you could kind of rub along and pretend there was nothing that made the contradictions in all of this apparent. So Westminster and Whitehall could keep on believing that nothing has changed, which they clearly, nothing changed institutionally in those places. Around the edges of the state in the periphery, we could somehow persuade ourselves that we were moving to a kind of post-parliamentary sovereignty, quasi-asymmetrical federalism. I mean, the language is pretty ugly, but the whole idea was that everything had changed. And both until Brexit, there was never a point where the contradictions were exploded. And I think the combination of maybe Brexit and COVID explodes the contradictions, okay? And at this point, it's really unhelpful in all kinds of ways, in terms of accountability, in terms of citizenship, in terms of basic public understanding of how we're governed. It's really unhelpful that England is never named by Labour or the Conservatives. Both main parties are equally guilty of this. And so we're ending up with, and I think I spoke about the idea of toxic stasis as being a potential dystopian future. I think that kind of not naming England feeds into this. I think that it doesn't have to be inculcating a particular version of England and Englishness, but just accepting they exist as governmental units. It exists as a governmental unit might actually be helpful. It's even more basic than that, I think, John.
Okay, thank you. So can I come back then, and I'll make this the last round of contributions if I can, really to the question which is likely to be widely debated after the elections, which is about the union. And as you've really suggested there, Richard, almost the nightmare situation is where Scotland stays in the union, even though more than half want to leave, and the balance of power is just the group of people who think it's too difficult. And Northern Ireland sort of waiting for a border poll. Wales, in which a third, according to some polls, now want independence. And in England, where, according to your book, 50% of the population more or less don't care one way or another what happens to the union. One of the really striking things about the union discussions from England, which is where I'm speaking from, is it is assumed that the union works for England, and it's the other bits that it may not work for. But that's not what your book says about what people in England think. So how, from an English point of view, and I speak as somebody who would describe himself as a unionist, how do we address this issue within England? Is it that a case needs to be made to people in England as to why the union might be a good thing? Or is it more, as perhaps Ailsa was suggesting, there are legitimate grievances in England, and if you address those, people might be much happier about the union? So if I may, I'll go to you first, Richard, and add any other points you want to on the discussion, then to Ailsa, and finally to Martin, if that's okay.
I was really hoping that you came to me last.
I'll come to you last if you.
I'll get it over with, and I can listen to wiser words. So I think this is extremely tricky, and at some level, I'm at the trite points maybe, but I'm glad I'm not a politician. I think that accepting that there is a problem as far as the English is concerned is really central to all of this. I think you're right, John, that the assumption is somehow, it's certainly the assumption of the political leaders of the two main parties, that the problem is in Scotland or potentially, and actually Northern Ireland. I mean, one of the things that is so clear about Northern Ireland is that so few people in the rest of the states care about Northern Ireland. It's depressing, but we show this in our book, and every single day that passes kind of confirms this. People just don't care. So the problem is these Scots nats, and we need to put them back in a box in some way or other. And as far as the kind of the leadership of the Conservative Party is concerned, the European Union was the fundamental problem, and now that they've gone, we can, everything is okay. And so actually accepting that there is an issue in England, there is an issue in Scotland, there is an issue in Wales, there is obviously an issue in Northern Ireland is a really important first step. And I don't even see that first step being made.
Yeah.
So I think we're so far. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm the prophet of doom on this particular Zoom webinar, but I don't even see the basic outlines of the recognition of the problem, let alone any solutions. And some of the solutions that are being proffered, so-called solutions, are non-solution solutions. Yep. So the old favourite of the Constitutional Convention, okay, which is, that's a non-solutions, that is can kicking on an epic scale. The idea, the Scottish Constitutional Convention worked because the Conservatives weren't part of it, the SNP weren't part of it. The only people who were there who basically agreed on what solution they were looking for. The idea that you can bring the different, the four territories together with representatives of each view, and then somehow they arrive at a consensus is an utter nonsense. So I don't, I genuinely think we're not even near recognizing the problem, which is to kind of, because I don't want to appear completely negative about this, it's also an opportunity. So if I was, the centre-left views this as a huge problem, okay? The centre-left, if nothing changes, is out of power for the foreseeable future at the UK level. Ailsa reminded me of a stat the other day, which blew me away, so I'm going to share this with you. There's some people who are going to be on this, listening to this, who are not of the centre-left, but if you are on the centre-left, think about this. If Labour doesn't regain seats in Scotland, and of course we're losing 20% of the seats in Wales by next time, then to win an overall majority, it needs to win Somerset North East, which is Jacob Rees-Mogg's seat, right? So it has a huge mountain to climb, and it's not going to get there on the basis of business as usual. So actually thinking about England and Englishness, giving a voice to England, how you might then work that into a different version of the state, is actually probably one of its best hopes in a pretty hopeless situation.
So the voice of doom is suggesting that we can't win back the historic Somerset coalfields that gave birth to Jimmy Cook, the president of the National Miners' Union.
I'm saying that Labour can, if it thinks.
Okay. Anyway, thank you. I'll go to Ailsa and Martin, and you can actually both be quite brief because we all promised to let Martin go off and write his next piece for The Guardian at about 2:30. So Ailsa.
Yes, I can be brief, and I can also be a bit more optimistic. So, one of the things, obviously, this book took us a really long time to write, and we stopped the analysis with the data in 2016, but we've been out in the fields every year since. And so, one of the things we did with the 2019 data was we've published an article trying to understand the United Kingdom and the extent to which it operates as a union of the mind, right? So we've got lots of, in political science, we've got lots of measures that look at how objectively decentralized states are, but we don't have decent measures that talk about how subjectively the electorates approach the union, and as how subjectively unionist they are, or how subjectively autonomous they are. And I think that's helpful because the news is not all bad. You know, if you conceive of the union as a union of the mind, there are different dimensions to that. There's an identity union. So what identity label do people use when they describe themselves? There's a union of solidarity, a social solidarity. There's a union of economic solidarity. And then there's a union of legitimacy or fairness, right? And so in terms of the bad news, you know, you've got more people in Scotland describing themselves as Scottish than British, with a big gap. You've got more people in Wales describing themselves as Welsh rather than British, with a smaller gap. And then you've got pretty much a dead heat in England. So in no part of Britain is there an overwhelming majority of any of the electorates describing themselves as British, using the label of the state. So that's not great news. But practically speaking, what impact does it have? We know that social solidarity, these expectations of similar entitlement, similar access to policy rights, social rights, that's still very high across the United Kingdom. We know that in terms of economic solidarity, that in principle, there is still a considerable degree of support for economic solidarity across the state. It comes apart a bit when you start to take it from something working in principle to something working in practice. But if you're framing it about sharing across the UK, there is still support in practice. It starts to wobble even more when you start to mention specific parts and sharing with specific parts, and then mentioning Scotland is like a red rag to a bull. So there's some bad news there. The real issue is one of the union of legitimacy or fairness. You know, when you're asking people how they feel about current government arrangements, how they feel about the distribution of resources, how the state is working as a union, and the evaluations are not positive. And all of those things we know relate to your support for the union, your support for the continuation of the state, your sense of ambivalent unionism, and also your support for independence for other parts, right? So there is a mix of good and bad news there. And I think if you're looking for something to do proactively, then it's to address those issues where there is the bad news. You know, there are real concerns about how things work in practice. There are real concerns about the distribution of that sense of economic solidarity in practice, and the way that the identity labels that people use, the way they align with those things. But there's good news as well. And the best news, the unsung story about this union is that despite all of this, there is still an incredibly high sense of social solidarity across the state.
Thank you. Martin.
Well, I'll be very quick, and I completely agree with what Ailsa's just said. And I think that, if you look at what is happening, what is the best thing that's happened in this country in the last year, it's the vaccination rollout. That has been an absolutely all points rollout. It's been delivered by different managements of the NHS, but the NHS exists from Land's End to John O'Groats. And I was very interested to see in a poll that was taken this week, I think, or last week, for the BBC to mark the centenary of partition in Ireland, that when offered a number of things which might need to be dealt with if Northern Ireland was to join the Republic in some form of United Ireland. There were lots of conditions attached to this. The overwhelmingly most important thing to voters in Northern Ireland was that the NHS should be extended across the whole of Ireland, because there isn't a socialised healthcare service in the Republic of Ireland. And so that social solidarity, which is embodied by the NHS, seems to me to be a precious thing in this context. The two very quick things I would just add. One is there is a problem in England. That's what the book's about. That's why the book should be studied. And the English need to think about Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland more than they do. That's not easy to instruct people to do, but it needs to happen. At the moment, people in England very rarely are aware in their day-to-day lives that they live on an island which contains Scotland and Wales. And practically the only time they ever do is when they see the weather forecast on the TV. It's the only daily reminder in our lives that we share stuff. And so I think that more needs to be done there. And my final point is just simply about devolution. Devolution was conceived under basically as an antidote to what Thatcher had done, Thatcher conservatism had done in Scotland. I mean, that was its immediate proximate trigger. Of course, it has a much longer and more complicated history than that. But the odd thing about devolution in the UK to Scotland is that we have never yet had the political relationship between a Scottish government and a UK government that devolution was created to try to solve. There has never yet been a Labour government in Scotland trying to cope with a Conservative government in the UK, or vice versa. And I think the arrival of a nationalist government, has thrown in 2007 put a really big spoke in the whole conception of devolution and the constitution, which had been created by New Labour. And so all I would say to that is, since nationalism is not going to go away, we've got to adjust, the constitution's got to be adjusted to the realities, not the other way around.
Martin, thank you very much. And thank you, Ailsa and Richard too. I hope the people on the call agree it's been a hugely rich discussion. And congratulations really to people like Richard and Ailsa, who 15 years ago were saying, against all the skeptics, this might actually be quite important. It's very clear that Englishness, whatever you think of it, is a real thing and a real force, and it and the issues confronting England as well as the Union have got to be addressed in our politics much more successfully than they are at the moment. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you for joining the call. A recording will go up on the website in about a week's time, and we'll obviously email everybody who registered for the session. But for now, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.